Okay, so we are in Spain. We spent last week getting through what I characterize as the golden age of Spain, which I'm going to place really in the ninth through, let's call it early 11th century. Now, it was characterized by a number of things. First of all, was Muslim hegemony. Right? We didn't actually quite emphasize this enough. I feel that one of the great gifts for Am Yisrael in the rise of the Muslim world is you suddenly had one relatively benevolent force uniting Jewry, the Jews from Bavel all the way to Spain. It was one unified cultural medium. It was one unified political medium to a certain degree, right? And it made communication and travel quite a bit easier. Remembering that we said in the 10th century at around, what was the date I pegged it at? Around 920 of the Common Era, the Caliphate of Cordoba came to existence, an independent Muslim kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula, also known as Al-Andalus, right? And as an independent entity, it only existed about 1033 when it broke into sort of subject kingdoms. So that's just kind of the political history. Other pieces that were critical to understand is the rise of language. I want to, maybe I'm in doubt whether to start there or end there. Well, we spoke about the rise of language on three fronts. First of all, we know that in Eretz Israel at the exact same time, the Masoretic tradition was really getting off the ground. Actually, was reaching its peak, not getting off the ground. And more than anything else, this was about the integrity of the biblical text. The last bastion of the oral law had really been, how do you read the text of the written? Meaning, because the Mishnah had already been redacted and written down. The Gemara, even though we noted that amongst the Gaonim, the Gemara still largely was oral in its transmission, nevertheless, there was a set structure to it, and we see that it had begun to be written down, right? Because copies of it were brought to North Africa and to Europe, or Gaonim were brought to North Africa and Europe to copy it out, more likely, right? Because the idea of putting a trunk full of Gemaras on a boat and traveling is kind of a modern phenomenon. But the text of the Torah itself had not been divorced from the living knowledge base of people who knew how to read it. And this is not a small element. Not a small element, and I want to come back to the significance of these three pieces once we get them in line. That's number one, is that the codification of the reading of the text through, nikudot, because Semitic languages don't have vowels. Number one. Number two, philology. Yeah, better than other things that start with like philosophy, which we'll get to, right? I was trying to avoid that. Philology is the study of text through time. Sorry, the study of language via text through time, right? Why does this matter to us? First of all, from our time period, we talked about Menachem ibn Saruk, right, who writes the Machberet, which is one of the first, not the first, because it was actually Rav Saadia Gaon who wrote the first dictionary. But Menachem ibn Saruk here in about 920, he's a protege of Chazdai ibn Shaput, right, who was the political advisor of Abd. How do you say his name? Hang on one second. Al-Rahman III, who was the Caliph of Cordoba, right? Rich Jew serving as advisor to Muslim king is a pattern, right? Said rich Jew serving advisor to Muslim king using his wealth and position to forward the interests of the Jewish community via learning Torah is also a set pattern. So
first place we see that is Yosef.
it's a pattern of galut. By the way, one of the reasons you say first place we see that is Yosef is in many ways the galut, the exile model of leadership is, well, as we saw in Daniel, the goyim are the malchut. They are the context which will allow us to live out our lives. So the best thing we can do from a leadership standpoint is get in good with the power structure and use it to our advantage, not in a sort of a selfish manipulative sense, although unfortunately that happens as well, but simply, hey, I do my job well, I get a lot of respect, says Chazay ibn Shaput, I own a lot of land, it's something we didn't speak about, we will in a second, so I'll use my wealth and position to forward the Torah, and therefore the good of the Jewish people, right? We said, so Menachem, who writes the Machberet, right, who has a fight with Dunash, right, Ibn Labrat, who has a different perspective, who wrote Dori Kra, And remember, their fight was not just about the two-lettered root versus the three-lettered root. Really, in its kishkas, Dunash believed that you could use Arabic to understand confusing words in Hebrew in the biblical text, and Menachem did not. And we're going to so we're going to speak about the significance of that in a moment. I want to lay out these three pieces. One is the Masoretic project. One is philology, which is a coming to awareness that there are abstract rules which govern the construct of the Hebrew language, specifically in the biblical text, but also by implication in later rabbinic texts. Right? And I'm going to use that phrase, the coming to consciousness, because where did this consciousness come from? From Arabic culture, because Arabic culture had a well-developed literary culture, even to a certain degree literary theory about how language works, and that's why Menachem rejected it, even though he used the rules of grammatical structure. He rejected the idea that Arabic could be used to explain mysterious words in biblical Hebrew, and Dunash accepted it. Right? The third piece is poetry. Right? This is the birth of the great age of poetry, and it was Dunash who took Arabic meter and grafted Jewish, what to that point had been liturgical poetry, onto Arabic meter and gave birth to the whole notion of medieval Jewish Arabic poetry, which became a growth industry. Right? And as I pointed out to you guys, that poetry in the Arab world served many purposes. First of all, it served the classic purpose of self-expression. It also served the purpose of public acclamation. Right? You wrote poems for kings and to celebrate wars and momentous occasions. It also had a certain element of the freestyle rap showdown in it, where when you wanted to devastate your enemies, you did so by composing, usually not freestyle, but by composing poetry which would be so devastating in its clever and subtle insults and so beautiful in its meter and imagery that your opponent would be shamed out of public office. Right? And this is one of the ways it would use. And the question that we're putting out there in the terms of poetry is one of the classic questions of Galut, which is the poetry of Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, who is, I would say, the poet laureate of Jewish history, 11th century, late 11th, early 12th century Spanish Jew. Is his poetry intrinsically expressive of a Jewish experience, as much as one could think about that, some truth of the Jewish people that found the mode of expression waiting for it in the era of classical Arabic poetry? Or, no, Arabic poetry is a thing unto itself, and the Jews were also doing it, but it's not expressive of anything intrinsic, and therefore if it had never found expression, nothing would have been lost. Right? This relates to this deeper question of who are the Jews? Right? And as I put forward to you, maybe there's something called Am Yisrael, which is like a spiritual abstraction, received the Torah at Sinai, but its manifestation, in exile at least, is the Jew. Right? This will become pressingly urgent when the Zionists, of course, want to recreate the new Jew. But when they come back here, what do they call the place? Israel. Right? So there's a whole complicated understanding that, look, we have an abstraction called Am Yisrael. Yeah, exactly. We have this abstraction called Am Yisrael. Am Yisrael came out of Egypt, got the Torah, built the temple, lived in a kingdom. The temple was destroyed. We came back. We built it again. The temple was destroyed, right? And then that we were already Jews in that Second Temple period, right? And notice, of course, that our cultural matrix was largely the Greco-Roman cultural matrix. Of course, we were fighting, and that's a lot of what the story of Hanukkah is about. It's like, who's in charge here? Who are we? The identity issues only become more and more pressing as we go further out into exile. So we have this question. Does each cultural context and each historical period offer a new avenue for an expression of the essential truth of Yisrael? Or is it just another layer of this thing called Jew, which we can just scrape away because, you know what, if the Jews had never been to Spain, then they wouldn't have written poetry. And if the Jews had never been to Poland, they wouldn't have come up with Pilpool. And if the Jews had never, gone to America, they wouldn't, eaten bagels, or whatever it is you want to say the Jews in America do. And the implication being that there's nothing intrinsically truthful or important about the experience of exile, and that there's some essential Israelite that's back there we're trying to scrape our way. Proto-Israelite, exactly. Archetype, which, by the way, those who are familiar with early Zionist writing should be familiar with the polemics that really swirl around this question. You had a question or a comment?
No, I was just doing Proto-Israelite.
Okay.
Although, can I venture
Please.
a guess at that answer?
I don't know about pen.
At least it seems like you're setting up a dichotomy between the Israelite and the Jew, right? In which the Israel, or
I'm offering one.
You're offering one. It's not necessarily that you believe it, right?
Yeah.
And I think what I find problematic about that is that it assumes like a static nature of what it means to be an Israelite, as opposed to putting something in process.
Great. So the challenge of this dichotomy is that it implies that the Israelite is static and the Jew is in process. So
or it's too static thing, however you want to.
So the other way to put it is that no, of course there's no static existence, but the Israelite is in Eretz Israel and the Jew is in Galut. If you look in the beginning of Netzach Yisrael, the Maharal's work on the nature of Am Yisrael, the first 2 or 3 prakim are devoted to a classic notion which has deeply penetrated Jewish thought to this very day, that exile is an unnatural state. It's an unnatural state. It's not who you are, it's like disease. And that even if the Maharal was quite aware at that point in Jewish history, we had spent the majority of our history in exile, nevertheless, it was unnatural, right? So the way to solve your challenge to that dichotomy is to say, okay, fine, it's not static, but the natural state of the Israelite is in Eretz Israel, where there's a developmental process, right? One of the things that Rav Kook points out, by the way, is that the reason that we are a nation that dwells alone, which God put at the crossroads of the ancient world, was to give us the sort of inward focus of an agricultural society which preserves its own values, thought patterns, and social structures, and yet as opposed to a mercantile society, which he points out is always like kind of going outside of itself a little bit, and yet we are at a cultural crossroads. So perforce, we're exposed, and of necessity, we have to grapple with, integrate, accept, reject all of the cultural currents of the world. So it could be that the dichotomy is that the Israelite has a solid base from which to relate to the elements of culture and history, whereas the Jew is like a chip tossed by the seas of time and culture.
But then in that scenario, would the Israelite have died at the end of the first temple? Because already with the Hellenistic, with Alexander, we became this mercantile empire.
Right. When did the Israelite die? I mean, I could go further. You pointing out that certainly the Second Temple period was hardly even though they were in Eretz Israel, a purist time. But I'll point out to a certain degree, there's always a revisionist historical perspective where there was never any such Israelite. I'm not even going to get into the biblical critical notion that the conquest never happened, et cetera, et cetera. Just go with the biblical narrative. We see very clearly that from the second Yoshua ben Nun crossed the Jordan River, there was cultural mingling with the Canaanites. This is clear because it was one of the major causes of the cultural downfall that led to the destruction of the first temple. And David had warriors from cultures all around. I mean, Uriah Hiti, right? It's just who's the guy from Gat? His name is slipping my mind, but he's the classic in the Gemara, the non-Jewish ally of David who becomes really his close, almost brother. So what you're pointing out is that all dichotomies, all these sort of archetypes are mythical to a certain degree. That's fine. Nevertheless, ubaharbanu mikol amim v'natan lanu et torato. We make a theological assertion that God chose us, that we are actually a certain people, and not just an amalgamation of our historical and cultural experiences. And if we are a certain people, then that people, whoever it is the one having the experiences. And so what I'm looking for is not so much a dichotomy, is a genotype-phenotype. The source code is Am Yisrael, but the expressed embodiment is the Jew. And we, as products of Zionist education, consciously or not, are living out a sort of a historical movement that has attempted to collapse those two. Is that now we want the source code of the Israelite to actually be manifest in the true Israelite form. And a lot of that is associated with disparaging 2,000 years of exile. So all this as an aside, I want to stay focused on here because I also want to get back to the list because we've got to finish Spain today. And I got some feedback that working with the timeline helps keep things in focus, so I'm trying to do it. Nevertheless, we had the Masoretic Project, which is the last uncoupling of the oral law from the written, because now we can actually open up a book, and anyone with a bit of education can figure out how to properly read the Torah text, as opposed to it being a oral tradition. Number one. Number two, the coming to consciousness of the constructs of the Hebrew language, philology. Number 3, poetry, as either a manifestation of a new avenue for a truth of Am Yisrael to find light, or an indication of the deepest cultural penetration that we could have possibly had, because it becomes core to Jewish culture in Spain. That's beyond doubt. The question is it a reflection of a core essence, or is it a reflection of a deep penetration of alien culture? And that word alien is what I want to actually pause on to wrap this up and move forward in histories. Is that in many ways the rise of these 3 notions is the rise of alien consciousness. As soon as you begin to think about language as opposed to speaking, it is part of the process of alienation, right? I'll put it to you very simply. Why, until the Masoretes, was there no need to codify and write down the way in which you vocalize the Torah text? Or why is it that Menachem and Dunash could argue so vociferously about the meanings of specific words in the Torah text and whether it was permissible to look to Arabic for their roots? It's a very simple reason. It wasn't relevant before this because
we weren't under Muslim dominant, a single dominant. So our own cultural autonomy was not threatened.
Okay, so you're speaking from a different side. That's true. I actually wasn't going there yet, which is that the hegemony and power of Muslim culture was a threat to our cultural integrity. True.
But you're saying that there's something having to do with the Masoretic text or the Masoretic project which triggered a need.
No, it's response to a need. Opposite. The Masoretic project was a response to a certain need. The project of the Machberet by Menachem and Dunash's work were a response to a need. It's very simple.
If father has availability to pass down to son, and vice versa, and the whole community is inclusive, and everybody hears the same word.
If we all spoke Hebrew in a natural context, there wouldn't be so much confusion about what those words meant and how do you read the text. Okay, I may not be an expert in reading the Torah text, but I can read it, because why? Because I actually speak the language. I've grown up in the cultural milieu. What you're seeing here is a progressive alienation from a root culture. What happens to most peoples in history who get alienated from the root cultures? They assimilate. They become something else. And it's called cultural progression or evolution, and there are all kinds of terms for it. The Jews have a notion that our culture is sacred. Therefore, we are constantly attempting to recapture it, to reassert it, to reinforce it, etc. But at this point in history, we're doing it speaking Arabic to each other. Judeo-Arabic, and there's all kinds of, but hang on a second. So what you're seeing is language becomes an abstraction. We're going to now think about the nature of it. Instead of just speaking the language, because it's my mode of expression, I'm going to think about how I express myself.
Almost like an arc.
An arc?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what you mean. Arc with a K or a C?
Arc through time, like it with a K.
Yeah, well, in many ways, that's what language is, because it preserves cultural concepts. Right?
The thing is, Hebrew wasn't a spoken language for a good bit before that. Mm-hmm. So I wonder.
So excellent. So excellent. So the challenge I hear from Dave is, wait a minute. The Jews haven't been speaking Hebrew together for an awfully long time, right? No question. And in fact, what we see is commonly Hebrew lends itself to amalgamation, right? The first amalgamation of Hebrew that we're familiar with is Koine, right? When Hebrew and Greek met, there's lots of stuff that the Jews couldn't speak about in Hebrew. So they adopted Greek terminology and perhaps even some Greek constructs. Why is that true? Because what were you speaking about in Greek that you couldn't speak about in Hebrew? The present cultural issues, sports, or or a lot of legal terms, bathhouse. I mean, like all kinds of, but things that dealt with the present cultural context. But we're going to carry forward our culture by preserving it in Hebrew, but to be functional, there's going to be amalgamation. Aramaic amalgamates with Hebrew quite well, even though it actually shares a root. So in some places, it just replaces it, right? Of course, Ladino. Right, Yiddish is a very well-known. There's a phenomenon where the Jews, on one hand, are constantly we're rooted in our culture, and on the other hand, we're very present to the world in which we live. And language very much serves as sort of that it was sort of the vessel for this amalgamation. But so Dave says, well, wait a minute. To say that up until now everybody spoke Hebrew, and now suddenly everybody's losing Hebrew, and that's why this is happening is not true, because they haven't been speaking Hebrew I mean, arguably the spoken language at the time of the Second Temple was Aramaic.
But in the Beit Knesset,
So there were cultural islands in the Beit Knesset, in the Beit Midrash. There were also the cultural elite, right? Hebrew is certainly a rabbinic language, and we have plenty of correspondence, right? That when people in North Africa were writing letters to people in Spain or back to the Gaonim, right? They were writing to each other in Hebrew primarily. Although there was Arabic became a lingua franca to a certain degree. So there is an element of the challenge of the loss of the spoken language. But what else? Here's where I really believe that the challenge of cultural hegemony really is what drives it. Is that up until now, the Greco-Roman culture,
Can you just define cultural hegemony?
who's in charge? What do I look to as the standard of not only my identity, am I an American Jew or Jewish American? All right, you understand the difference? Right? If I'm an American Jew, then primarily my culture is Jewish. I just happen to live in America. If I'm a Jewish American, then primarily my culture is American, and I happen to be of the Jewish persuasion, as they say. Right? So when it was the Greco-Roman culture in the Byzantine world, the early Byzantine world, the Roman world, we saw that this was a culture of conflict. That there was very little temptation to just meld into Greco-Roman culture because the Christians had claimed to replace us and were not interested in accepting us. Right? The Romans saw us as this indigestible element in the Roman Empire. It was a well-established problematic relationship. Not so in the Muslim world, especially in Spain. The Jews, even though technically we spoke about the Pact of Omar and the Jews were supposed to be second-class citizens in Spain, life was good. They were wealthy landowners. There was not only individuals of high nobility, but there was plenty of petty nobility, artisans, physicians. Jewish. There were Jewish knights. We're going to speak about Shmuel HaNagid in a moment, right? So there was a deep intrusion of Muslim culture, and this is where poetry becomes the real question. Is Jewish poetry a reflection of the Jews becoming more like the Arabs? Or is their poetry indicative of the fact that the poetry was always there? It just flowered in a cultural medium that gave new tools to it. I don't have an answer for you. Yeah?
what I understand about the rise of Arab culture, poetry was used as a way of communication because there was no written text at the time.
Correct.
In the 5th and 6th centuries in Saudi Arabia, or what is now Saudi Arabia. So, from what I understand, the Jews had a written text and were literate, going back
much before that.
Before then.
Sure.
So there would be less of a need for poetry.
Less of a need for poetry. I hear what you're saying, meaning
Why rhyme in poetry if you can write it down? Who cares about this clever rhyme that you can remember later?
right.
Stories were passed down in Arabic and poetry because there was no written text.
Sure. But by the time our time period in the 10th and 11th century, where written texts were well established in Spain in multiple languages, poetry had evolved, and it became a source of expression in its broadest sense. So, whatever the cause, and by the way, this is not really the context to really do the research, but I'm putting out there the question because Spain is a test case. What you have here is the rise of an alien consciousness. First, in the looking at our own culture from the outside and deriving the rules. Think of what Menachem's doing. He's the first person to try to figure out grammatical rules for a revealed text. That's implying that God either was constrained by rules, or these rules are sort of like emergent from the Word of God, or it's also maybe implying that Moshe had a heavy hand in writing the text. Like meaning once you start positing grammatical rules to the biblical text, you're adding a layer to it that was not there in its purely revelatory discussion. And I heard Rav Aaron bring up in Shir the other day this question of why the Pashtanim? Why the Pashtanim? Like we see in the Gemara is not so interested in questions of Pshat. Right? And suddenly in the Rishonim, with this like explosion of the Pashtanim, like what does this word actually mean? Right? Is it because, as Rav Aaron said, the Chachamim weren't so interested in Pshat, they were interested in Drush, and that's just like what they were doing? Or is it partially, at least what I'm asserting, which is that there got a point in history where people started to lose handle on Pshat? Even though it's true that we had not been speaking Hebrew as a concentrated culture for many years, nevertheless, there's a progression. As the Galut gets deeper and further and wider, of a loss of the average person to even relate to the Pshat. And so the task of people like Rashi and other Pashtanim, Rashi, even though he calls himself a Pashtan, I have my doubts.
Well, he's deeply interested in the meaning words.
Well, he's deeply interested in the meaning words for sure. I don't want to go to Rashi right now because that's Europe, and we're going to go there next week. Okay, I give you this notion of rise of alien consciousness because in many ways this is what Galut is. It's not natural living. It's an awareness of myself as not where I belong. We spoke about this a while ago. That at its root, exile in the individual experience is alienation. I have a sense of my essential self that has been violated and am alienated from who I believe I should be. In the national historical sense, it's, wow, we belong there, or our culture is actually like this, and we're constantly struggling with the context within which we find ourselves geographically and culturally. In the theological sense, I pointed out that exile is the first act of creation, because in the beginning there was only God, and that separation is the absolutely necessary precursor to the relationship which Judaism teaches is the reason God created the world in the first place. Now, the Jew represents alien culture in Europe. How interesting. That's what the Jew is. You look in European literature, the Jew is the quintessential alien, right? And as such, offers a moral voice. The Jew in the canary in the mine shaft model, right? That you can tell a society in many ways, at least through European history, as how it began to treat its Jews usually end bad, right? And in the very uncomfortable aspects of society that the Jew embodies, like money lending, right? You want a great treatment of this. I've told you guys before, you should really read it, but by Sir Walter Scott. It's not Rob Roy. It's called Ivanhoe. Ivanhoe, great book. Highly recommend it. And the character of Isaac the Jew in Ivanhoe, Scott actually recognizes the Jew as a product of European society, meaning the Jew is what he is because of how Europe has treated him. The Jew embodies all the things that Europe doesn't want, but it has to have in the terms of money lending, and he becomes the embodiment of that in this very ugly, untrustworthy, manipulative, self-centered, right? It's all the dark ugliness that gets squished into those spaces in between, but those spaces in between that actually lubricates society and allows it to go. Right? The alien consciousness, just an element here. Now we're going to get back into the flow of history. So despite that being true, the Jews are very, very comfortable in Spain still, right up until one of the first turning points. Spain was Christian under the, I'm sorry, I stayed up quite late last night. Under the Visigoths, we spoke about that, right? And then it was conquered by the Muslims in approximately 711. It took them more than 1 year to do it, right? We spoke about the turning point, the Battle of Tours in 732 and Charles Martel, right? In many ways, from the Christian historiography, Charles Martel's battle at Tours wasn't just the stopping of the Muslim advance. It's the beginning of something called the Reconquista. There's a reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula that will happen by Christian. It's about a 700-year process, and it's interesting. That's why it's called a Christian historiography, because the way you tell your story is largely dictated by how you understand its end, right? So we've got some trouble on the Iberian Peninsula. That in 1033, the United Kingdom of Al-Andalus breaks up into various Muslim states. At that point, the intrusion of the Christians back from Europe through the Pyrenees into northern Spain increases. And for the first time, in 1066, we have a massacre of Jews on the Iberian Peninsula, and it is by the Muslims, not the Christians. What happens? Well, you got to go a few years before this to understand that the kingdom of Granada is still the strongest kingdom in the remnants of the Caliphate of Cordoba. And one of the most well-known names to come out of there is a Jew named Shmuel HaNagid. Shmuel HaNagid began his life as a shopkeeper in Malaga. He had a neighbor who was a maid to the vizier of the king of Granada. And this maid, whenever she needed to write a letter to the vizier, would go to the shopkeeper to write her letters. You following this story? The vizier was quite struck by the vocabulary, wit, and intelligence of this maid and said, hey, wait a minute, who's writing these letters for you? And she tells him, and he goes into this shop to meet Shmuel, then Shmuel HaLevi, right? And he says, you deserve something better than a shop. You should come and be my advisor. So he becomes the advisor to the advisor of the king. So he's quite good. He's giving the vizier the great information. The king prospers in everything he does. Comes one day, the vizier falls sick, and he's on his deathbed. And the king comes and he weeps next to his deathbed, and he says, who's going to advise me now that you're going to die? And he says, well, I've got news for you, Your Majesty. It was never me that was advising you. It was this Jew. You should take him and take care of him. He'll treat you well. And indeed, Shmuel Halevi becomes Shmuel HaNagi, the vizier to the king of Cordoba, in the mid-11th century. We can call it about probably 1040-ish. So like the dates at these points are, for some reason, multiple. There's like different documentation. I think it's probably because of the difference between the Christian and the Muslim calendars, but I'm not entirely sure. For our purposes, mid-11th century is just fine, right? But what's amazing is I want you to understand that, first of all, he is one of the great poets of Jewish history. He's also a well-recognized halachic authority, Talmudist, as they say. He, again, uses his wealth. One of the primary projects that he undertakes is copying copies of the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the Torah, and distributing them to Spanish Jewry, because books are still extremely rare at this point, right? And he eventually commands the armies of Granada. You have a Jew marching into battle at the head of Muslim armies. He dies in honorable old age, and his son, Yosef, inherits his position, and the way that the story is told is that Yosef had all of his good traits except for one, humility. Yeah. And there was a contentious succession to the king. Yosef backed the wrong party, right? And there was a wave of riots that swept Granada, and 150 Jewish families were destroyed, which was basically the bulk of all the Jews in Granada. 1066, the Granada Massacre marks the first mass killing of Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, right? Under the Muslim rule still. But nevertheless, it's seen as a turning point because in 1085, Toledo, which is a major city in central Spain, falls to Christian armies. And that's less than 20 years later. Why does that matter? Because it is at this point that the Jews start to say, I think Christian world might be better for us than the Muslim one. And you begin to have Jews fleeing the Muslim world into the Christian north, which is unique, because up until that point, the perception was that life was better for the Jews in the Muslim world. It's important to understand that when the Reconquista, the fall of Toledo, is a real sort of upswing in the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula by the Christians, right? It's happening at the same time, we'll speak about this next week in Europe, at the same time the Crusades are about to start. You know, classically, the first Crusade is usually pinned at around 1095. Proclaimed in 1095 by Pope Urban II, if I'm not mistaken. There is some evidence, actually, that a good 30 years earlier, the previous pope, whose name evades me at this moment, had actually offered indulgences and various theological favors to people who would participate in the Reconquista of Spain from the Muslims. So that means it seems the crusading instinct actually got started off sending people south to Spain, as opposed to over to the what we now call the Middle East. It's also important, and this is not a class in social history, so I can't get into it too much, but it's important to understand that the population of Europe was swelling at this point. So the Crusades and also the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula in many ways were also just population movements.
Population control.
Well, population movement, it wasn't necessarily conscious like send people, it was like there's just pressure, people start to move, it becomes more viable to get on your horse and sort of march south and conquer land from the Muslims when things are too crowded around here. If there's an easy field over there you can just live in, like, sounds nice, Pope, but, right, you know, like yeah, well, that's what it is. And then it's important not to forget that these sort of very base physical motivations drive much of history to this very day, right? A little bit less so today in the nature of technology and food production than it used to be, but they're still there, right? So the crusading impulse leads to a certain panic on the part of the Muslim kingdoms. Now, the Muslim kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula had been dancing a certain dance with the North African Muslim kingdoms for a century or more, right? And again, like, we can't go through the details of like which kingdom rose and which kingdom fell. It's like just not possible for us to do together. But the general dynamic was the perception of the truly Arabic ruling culture in Al-Andalus, in the Iberian Peninsula, was very worldly and therefore perceived as somewhat decadent and weak in the face of the fanatical Christian northern armies. So they were constantly trying to refresh their ranks from the North African Berber kingdoms. The Berbers were North African tribes that had converted, non-Arabic North African tribes that had converted to Islam in the very first wave of conquest that swept out of the Arabian Peninsula, were considered like sort of like more fanatical than their Arab teachers. And so therefore they periodically would either overthrow the kingdom that was ruling in the Iberian Peninsula, or they were even invited in periodically to like take over control and reinforce both culturally and militarily, right? And that dynamic was what led to the progressive deterioration with the relationship with the Jews, because the Berbers would come in and insist on the enforcement of the Pact of Omar, not just because of their religious fanaticism, but because any new party who's coming into power will have an interest in stripping as many people of the old party of the power as they can. And the excuse to be able to knock all the Jews out of high office, confiscate their wealth, and give their positions to your own allies under the aegis, right, under the aegis of religious law is like just as good as it gets. So for our purposes, the marker we're going to place in this dynamic is in 1172, the Rambam flees Spain for North Africa. Right, 1170, Rambam was still very young. He dies in 1204. He's born, I believe, in 1140. So that puts him at 32. I thought he was younger than that when he left. Yeah?
Is there any connection between the Rambam and Yosef Hanabi?
No, because Shmuel Nagid dies 100 years earlier.
No, I was talking about Yosef Shmuel Nagid's son.
Oh, Yosef. No, because he dies in the Grenada massacres in 1066.
Okay.
So he also died 100 years later. No, the Rambam, in terms of where there is a connection, is that one of the contemporaries of Shmuel Nagid was Ri Migash, of Yosef ibn Migash. He is considered to be the inheritor of Rabbi Fassi, right? In the generations of the development of the oral law, which is actually maybe worthwhile pausing and pointing out to you guys at this point if you're not familiar with, we spoke about the Mishnah. This we know, right? The Mishnah comes to a close. The commentary on the Mishnah is, of course, the Gemara. Now, let's remember that the Gemara is a organic work, but its primary goal is to figure out what God wants you to do, right? And in that respect, there's Agadata, as opposed to philosophy, and there's Halacha, which is like the practical bottom line, right? The problem with learning Halacha from the Gemara is that you actually have to know where to look, and you have to be able to sort through the logical structures of the Gemara in order to decide what the resolution is. So early on in North Africa, there developed a school, first with Rabbeinu Hananel, where he wrote the first linear commentary on the Gemara, tried to make it clear what the conclusions were. But in those of you who are familiar with the Gemara, the Rabbeinu Hananel, by the way, is your best friend on the page, if he's there, right? It's a very thin commentary that's usually on the outside margin, yeah. First commentary on the Gemara. It's a very big step. Why? Because before Rabbeinu Hananel, they were writing the Gemara, and then the Gaonim weren't relating to the Gemara on that same level because the Gaonim were still a living central authority. They were giving Shailot and Tshuvot. They were answering. You wanted to know what the halacha was. They told you. Of course, they used the Gemara to figure out what it was, but the Gemara didn't hold that central place. The Rabbeinu Hananel marks a shift where the Gemara begins to be the central authority of Am Yisrael. The Rif, Rabbeinu Alfasi, student of Rabbi Yitzchak Alfas, right? Alfas is in Fez, is in modern Algeria. In Morocco? Okay, Fez in Morocco. Thank you. He says still too much. And what the Rif does, he boils down the Gemara and extracts its purely halachic content. Right? But he keeps the structure of the Gemara. So what's he done? It's an assumption that the Gemara is untouchable. It is now the central focus for our figuring out what God wants of us. But it's too hard for the average person to do it as it is. So the Rif strips away everything except what you need. Right? He is a major foundation stone of the way we relate to halacha today. His student, Rimigash, doesn't, as far as we know, hand off the torch to anyone in particular. However, there is a story that's told that the Rambam was brought into the Rimigash when the Rambam was like 3 years old, and the Rimigash was on his deathbed. It's probably apocryphal because if you do the dates, it's highly unlikely this could happen. Nevertheless, why is this? And the Rimigash kissed him on his head and said, "You're it," so to speak, right? But why is this story told? Because the Rambam was it. He was the next major turning point in the development of halacha. What did the Rambam do? He said, he said you can't use the structure of the Gemara at all anymore anyway, because nobody can handle it. The average person, if they want to know Hilchos Brachos, you can't just open up the Gemara and Brachos, right? Because it's going to refer you to over here and over there, and if you really want to know, you got to know this and that. The Gemara is a holistic document, right? By which I mean that I'll put it in reverse. What's a linear document? When you were in 7th grade in your earth science class, sorry if I bring back bad memories for anybody, right? You got a textbook, and that textbook assumed you were total ignoramus, because it told you on the first page everything you needed to know in order to understand the second page. You turn to the second page, it'll tell you everything you know to understand the third page, right? Therefore, if you opened up the textbook in the middle, granted, so chapters are structured to be certain, like integral, but nevertheless, the chapters do assume you've learned what came before, right? You don't do that. You start at the beginning, you move through the end. That's linear. It's a classic Greek methodology of teaching. Very powerful, right? What is the Gemara? The first word in the Gemara, or at least the Mishnah at the front of the Gemara, is Mematai, right? The Gemara takes it at the same time. They say Tana Mehecha Kai. Like, what were we just talking about? What do you mean what were we just talking about? Isn't this the beginning? No. This just happened to be where we started. It's not the beginning. Because every word of the Gemara is some way or another intrinsically connected to every other word of the Gemara. It's a holistic document. When you touch one word, the whole thing quivers. So therefore, to really understand it at all, you actually have to understand all of it. And you know who it is that really brings this full perspective to learning the Gemara? This is what we call the Tosfot. Right? Not that the people before them didn't have that, but they're the ones on the page that institutionalized this way of learning Gemara. And we'll get to them when we get to European history. Why does that matter? Because the Rambam says, "Oh, I've got a headache." Rambam starts to fall asleep in halacha class, and he says, "Like I can't do this. I'm going to process the entire Gemara in my mind and break it into 14 user-friendly linear categories." Now, says the Rambam, in a Greek, interestingly enough, the Rambam, of course, taking the Greek intellectual model, says, if you want to know where brachos are, there should be a thing called brachot. And everything you need to know about brachot should be there. Makes sense. And that's what he does. And by doing that, he completely shifts the nature of the halakhic discussion. The Gemara is still there. In the age of Rishonim, it still is central. But he begins a shift, which we won't speak about now, but will culminate really in the tour. Yeah, Eitan.
So, like you said, Rambam made these sorts of categories, but we do have categories in the Gemara. Does the Gemara make those categories?
Or does it stick to them?
Gemara doesn't stick to them. The categories are really rooted in the Mishnah.
Like Cholin, Sukkos, getting...
No, the Masechtot are rooted in the Mishnah.
So they did divide them, like the...
They did divide them, but they're loose. I would call them nodes as opposed to categories. Because they're next. There's a nexus. In Brachot, it's a nexus. But it's like...
There is a concentration of the laws of Brachot and Tefillah in Masechet Brachot. But you've got to go to Rosh Hashanah and Megillah and Ta'anit for other things that are also related to Brachot that aren't included in Masechet Brachot.
A great distinction that Dave gave when we were learning Tefillah here is that Masechet Brachot is about Tefillah, the halacha of Tefillah, and Masechet Ta'anit is about the relationship of Tefillah. Right? If you want to know what Tefillah is, you'd have to look at them both, and then huge portions of it will also end up in Rosh Hashanah and other places. So yeah, they're nodes in this sort of like network frame, and therefore they're a good place to start. But any realistic adventure into comprehensive learning is going to lead you into many other places. The Rambam said that that's not practical for the average person to function. Now notice the focus on functionality. He's not telling you don't learn the Gemara. He's telling you if you want to actually be able to function as a Jew, which becomes an increasingly pressing issue because of two things. First of all, as Galut spreads, the distance from any central authority who can help you out in solving your problems becomes much more difficult, number one. Number two, life is getting more complicated. New issues are arising all the time. I'm not saying that the old world was very simple and that the new world is very complicated. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. I'm not sure. My point is that the old world you're still carrying with you. All the issues of the old world don't go away. That's what halacha is. It preserves all the issues of the old world. How many of you guys wash your hands before you eat bread, right? Like we're not living in a world of ochling, chulim v'tahara. We're not living in a world where we're mafresh challah or kohanim eat things. No, we're doing that. Why? Because of an expectation of a world that will be. So we're carrying all kinds of behaviors from old. Plus, by the way, we're carrying the behaviors of the present world. So if there's a cumulative aspect to halakha, which can be overwhelming. I don't know if you guys have ever experienced this, right? So the Rambam wanted to make it more functional because this is a function of the need to survive, not like to eat, but to survive in the sense of being able to live as a Jew. So when he flees what is a rise of, again, this North African Berber-based fanaticism in Islam in the Iberian Peninsula, he flees to North Africa. He eventually settles in, it's not Cairo at the time, it's Fustat. It will become Cairo, actually in not so much time as far as I recall.
Known as Old Cairo.
Right. So it establishes himself as, I would say, one of the real pillars of the age of the Rishonim. And that's the age that we're shifting into. Out of, right, Spain, in many ways, begins the age of the Rishonim. We talked about the Gaonim. We haven't talked about the Rishonim, and we're stepping into the Rishonim gradually right now. Actually, I'm going to leave an abstract discussion of the Rishonim till next week when we talk about Europe. Because I actually want to hit all of the following points all the way through the expulsion. I've got 10 minutes for the expulsion. Okay. What's happening in the bigger picture, by the way, the Crusaders are getting walloped. The Rambam flees in 1172. The Crusaders got walloped in 1187. The Battle of the Horns of Hittin here in Eretz Israel. That is the sort of like high point of the Crusades. It begins to retreat from there. Saladin, the non-Arabic Arab hero, he's a Kurd, as far as I know. What? Ayyubid. You heard it there first. The next big event for us in consciousness, actually, is very important, that in 1250, Rav Moshe Shem Tov de Leon, it is after all Lag BaOmer, reveals the Zohar in Castile. Now, Castile at this point is a Christian kingdom, but of course his culture is the Jewish culture developed in the Muslim world. And in 1250, the revelation of the Zohar is a classic breaking forth of light out of darkness. The Jews of Spain were gripped with the same despair that many of the Muslims of Spain were gripped by, which was the collapse of a culture that for hundreds of years had not just been their home and their context, but had been a source of very rich, productive, somewhat peaceful life in the face of what they perceived to be conquering armies. I'm not going to get into, like, who was right in this sense. Now, why did I use the language of revealed? Well, first of all, because it works well with the Zohar. Second of all, what is the Zohar?
It's the Book of Splendor.
The Book of Splendor. Thank you very much. What is it? What is the traditional...
It's an associative commentary.
Associative commentary on everything, but loosely structured on the Chumash. It's very important that the Zohar is associated directly with the Chumash. Right? It is not, in the sense of the Gemara, a adventure in rabbinic cultural life exploration. All the agadatot of the Gemara are avowedly just part of rabbinic life. The Zohar is associated with the source, so to speak, number one. Number two, what language is it written in? Aramaic. Right? This is one of the big sources of the controversy. Let me just say one word about the controversy. Of course, traditional Jewish sources say, where does the Zohar come from? The Rashbi. It's Lag BaOmer, right? The Zohar represents that which was revealed to Rashbi by Eliyahu Hanavi. You can get the Tikkun Zohar and exactly what each part is. I'm not an expert, right? But in its classical sense, the Zohar was revealed to Rashbi by Eliyahu Hanavi. That's what he was doing in that cave. Now, why then does it first appear in print in 1250 in Castile? Right? You should know, when the Zohar itself appeared, there was a significant controversy amongst the Jews about whether it was to be accepted as an authoritative text or not. Down to the Achronim, there were Achronim who held out against it. But nevertheless, it swept Am Yisrael, almost probably second only to the Torah of the Arizal, in terms of its sort of like instant acceptance as authoritative text. Right? The Zohar is an evocative text. What do I mean? There are two ways to communicate meaning. We've spoken about this here, I feel. Oh, Danny brought it up. One is discursive. Right? I can tell you about things. Like the Mishnah is trying to tell you about things. Granted, it does it in ways that forces you to think in the ways it wants you to think in, but it's information delivery. The other way to try to teach you something is to evoke an experience within you. Poetry, by the way, is the great tool for this, right? If I want you to understand love, we could talk all about it, or I could try imagery of roses and dew and the blush of dawn and the sweet whispers in the pines and etc. And what am I trying to do? I'm trying to touch some core experience that you have, that we share, which transcends the technical abilities of language to communicate, but rather it can evoke. And the Zohar is an evocative text. True, there is perhaps a system of thought within it, right? And much, perhaps more than one. And like, I'm not a scholar of the Zohar, so I'm not even gonna like go there in terms of trying to say what it is. But why am I calling it an evocative text? Because this distinction between the Nigla and the Nistar, the revealed Torah and the hidden Torah, right? It is often missed what the simple meaning of that is. The revealed Torah is that which has always been out in the open, and therefore subject to critical review, as you would call it, right? The Gemara, every assertion the Gemara makes, it not only gets combated within the Gemara itself, but then gets combated down through every generation to this very day. You guys were doing it this morning, right? So therefore, any conclusion drawn in the Gemara is seen to be robust because it's held up to a critical process. Whereas the Nistar, the hidden Torah, was hidden, right? People quietly learning by themselves, maybe with a few other people. No some public discussion of this. You're not printing or even writing out texts to distribute to other people so they can look at it and come to their own conclusions and you can compare. No. I mean, the Gemara in Chagiga discusses the fact that the Sodot of the Torah are not actually meant to be taught at all. If you have a student that comes to you, you can say, Rashi Prakim. You tell him, oh yeah, Rabbi, I had this thought I was reading in Yechezkel the other day, and this occurred to me. You don't explain it to him. You say, you should take a look at the 32nd parak. Right? Why? Because you're trying to evoke something in them by guiding them along a path, but you're not going to communicate it. Why? Because sod, that which is hidden, as we've spoken about before, is the level of meaning which is my experience of the text.
Which can't be communicated.
Which cannot be communicated. That's what a secret is. Because as soon as you communicate it, it's not a secret anymore.
So what's the consciousness of the Zohar?
I don't know. I don't know. But I can tell you that one of the reasons I believe that it appeared at this historical time is that it is the Ruach. The Zohar is an emotive text. The Zohar is a passionate text. It evokes very strong feeling. Right? And it was a time when the Ruach of Am Yisrael was progressively being shattered in Spain. One of the ways that I understand the dynamic between Rav Moshe de Leon, who, by the way, we have other Kabbalistic texts that he wrote. They're nothing near this caliber. Right? And the question of Rashbi, I think is relatively simple, and it goes back to one of the major themes that we've developed along, which is that the perception of text was very different in their day. Right? Whatever Rashbi brought out of the cave was never written down in a book and handed to students. It was Kabbalah pel ozen. You know, literally, I'll teach it to you if I feel like you are a fit student, and you will only teach it to anybody else if you feel that they are a fit student, and we'll wrap it in all kinds of crazy, obscure imagery so that if it gets out, nobody who's lacking the comprehension will be able to understand it. Furthermore, as time goes by, imagery changes, as we know, right? What is a relevant metaphor to us is not a relevant metaphor to someone 1,000 years ago and won't be a relevant metaphor to someone 1,000 years from now. And so therefore, the obscurity of the references used increases over time. And at a certain point, Moshe de Leon perhaps decides that this is the time that we actually have to spread this amongst a wider base. And this begins a pattern of a taking out from the Nistar, from the hidden places, certain aspects of the Torah which become widespread. And when the printing press comes, oy vavoy, Kabbalah, 101. They're like Kabbalah for dummies. All kinds of people are starting to write books about stuff that used to be very, very chosen members of Am Yisrael were discussing or are going to hit the printing press. And we're going to see what the results of that are when we get to that age, in the 15th century. But either way, what the Zohar does is it also is going to provide a cosmic context for the crushing defeat fall of Spanish Jewry, right? In terms of the struggle of light and darkness, the breaking of a world being part of its fixing, the scattering of sparks throughout the world being part of the divine plan for its eventual redemption, because the Spanish Jewry, which indeed gets scattered throughout the world, sees itself as the nobility of Am Yisrael, as we spoke about last week at the beginning, right? They are the exiles from Jerusalem, from the first temple, right? And they will carry that, for good and bad, attitude throughout their exile, right? The Zohar. Gotta give Rashbi his due. We're going to actually probably have to leave the expulsion to the beginning of next week, but I do want to hit a couple more points to set it up. In 1306, a major event for halakhic development, and certainly for local Spanish Jewry happens. It was the expulsion of the Jews from France. France is not really a state yet, so you can't really say the Jews from France the way you think of it. It's not the France of today, but nevertheless, there were periodic expulsions from that region, and this is one of them. Who comes to Spain at this point? The Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher ben Yehiel comes to Spain. Why does this matter? First of all, it's cool because we know the Rosh has got a commentary on the Gemara, right? He meets the Rashba, which must have been quite a conversation. The Rashba gets him a job in Toledo, where he becomes the chief rabbi. But what's most important is the Rosh is the culmination of the whole school of Tosfos. Ashkenazi Torah in one hand. He comes to Toledo, where he not only interacts with the Rashba and the other heads of Jewry, but see, the Spanish Jews had been doing something all along that the Ashkenazim hadn't been doing, because it was part of Spanish culture that wasn't part of Ashkenazi Christian culture, which was legal codification. The Muslims were very into legal codification, and the European kingdoms were not so much so. The Tosfos weren't writing halakhic works.
Sort of.
No, there were halakhic conclusions, but they weren't writing. It's true, but notice those are really structured still in the Chumash. The idea of a purely legal text did not exist in their culture. The Rambam forges that path, and the many scholarly articles on this subject that this was part of Spanish Muslim culture. When the Rosh encounters this, he begins a project of trying to integrate Spanish and Ashkenazi Torah, which the commentary of the Rosh begins, but who truly succeeds in that project is the Rosh's son, the Tur, Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Asher, right? And we'll speak about the significance of the Tur next week, but I want you to understand that this is happening as Spanish Jewry is beginning to collapse. The next marker, and we'll probably just wait here, the next marker is that in 1391, Ferdinand Martinez, who's confessor to the Queen Mother, incites massacres across Spain. 1391, 100 years before the expulsion of Spain, is the first wave of mass conversions that Am Yisrael will see. Of Jews, right? Because you had Muslims that converted Christians, Christians converted Muslims. This is the first wave of mass conversion of Jews that we see in Spain. It creates the problem for the Spanish Christians of the Moranos, the Conversos, the secret Jews, right? But what's most important, I want to leave you with this question. 200 years before this was the First Crusade. Actually, 300 years was the First Crusade. And the First Crusade in Ashkenazi history, at least the way we remember it, was marked also by attempts at conversion. And what was the response of the Jews in Europe to such an attempt? Death. Right? Not only death, but there are many very dramatic stories about how the Jews didn't even wait for the Crusaders to come. That they actually sanctified themselves, killed their own families, and then ritually killed themselves. You know, and even if only half the stories are true, it's still a fairly impressive half. So the big question, which we'll be holding, is that when the sword and the cross came to Spain, why is it that so many Spanish Jews chose to convert instead of die? Was there some difference between Ashkenazi culture and Spanish culture that opened that door? Was it a shift in generation? What was it that ultimately led to hundreds of thousands of Jews that were willing to convert to Catholicism instead of, in 1491, being expelled or dying? So we're going to stop there. It's 10 o'clock. Yeah.